I think for years, managers were told that Gen Z has an attitude problem. And again, not to say that there aren't folks out there with attitude problems, but the data just suggests that maybe that was a little bit of a misguided statement. And if you're uh, only solving for attitude, then you're probably solving for the wrong thing.
Welcome to the Wellable Weekly Podcast, where we talk about key topics and trends at the intersection of well-being, technology, and HR. I'm Nick, along with my good friend and co-host, Geoff. Geoff, how's it going?
Yeah, it's going well, Nick. I like the shirt, repping the Greek gear.
It's a new edition here. I just got it. For those who don't know, I actually am recording this podcast from Greece. I'm here for a few weeks, so we didn't want to skip a week. So Geoff and I are meeting. It's actually, I'm trying to think what time. It's like my late afternoon. It's his morning. But excited to be here. I'm glad the internet's working. I think we had some issues early on, but we can hop right into it. It's actually probably a very kind of timely topic. There's this really good study that we talked about on Wellable Weekly related to remote work. Obviously, what I'm doing in Greece right now is remote work. But effectively, the gist of the article is it's a true study from a couple of economists. One who we've talked about before, Nicholas Bloom from Stanford, but just continuing to provide ongoing data on remote work. And really, I think there's a belief, if you just follow the news, that more and more companies like Amazon, JP Morgan, the list goes on, are doing return to office mandates. In some cases, it's 5 days, some cases 4, but it's pretty significant in terms of its push to get people into the office more frequently. And if you just watch the news, you would think, we're moving to more and more on-site work and less remote work or less work from home. And the study shows that we've kind of effectively plateaued. So if you look at the month of May, so just last month, 26% of the paid full-time days were work from home. So about a quarter. You look at that number from 2 years ago, it's about 27%. If you just look at that chart by month for the last 4 years, you'll see a big spike, which is this post-COVID spike. And it's just slowly declining because people have, returned to normal. But the new normal isn't a pre-COVID normal. The pre-COVID normal is 7% of people were working remote days, or 7% of days were remote or work from home. So it's drastically increased by percentage or by multiple, but it seems to have plateaued at this 1 in 4 days are remote.
Yeah, and I think the big company story is one that obviously gets a lot of attention, right? Whether it's JP Morgan, Jamie Dimon has long been a real advocate for full RTO, encouraging and in some cases mandating that JP Morgan associates come back to the office 5 days a week. And there are others that have made similar headlines, but that is of course a legitimate strategic choice for their culture, their business model, right? JP Morgan and other really large companies can afford maybe to lose some people who won't come in, and most employers just can't really and haven't really made that same bet, and I think have more kind of come to terms with this new normal, to use a throwback term from the pandemic era. It does kind of feel like if you look at this data with the true kind of leveling out and plateauing, that we are in a place where at this point we probably have a pretty good sense of what the average employer is going to be asking their staff to do when it comes to working arrangements, right? I think for a period there, it was kind of going back and forth between two or 3 days in office. I know Wellable personally, right? We've had 2 days as a requirement for our anchor days, Wednesdays and Thursdays in our offices for the better part of 5 years now, right? And that's something that I don't really see that changing anytime soon for us. And it kind of feels like others who have had similar policies are feeling like those decisions have been supported by kind of what this new expectation really is for your average employer.
Yeah, I'm feeling pretty good maybe about if you're just strictly looking at the ability to work from home as a benefit to attract talent. I feel pretty good about our policy, right? We're 2 days a week, but we offer, there are a bunch, I think 5 weeks of the year we are fully remote. So that's 5 weeks removed out of it. I think everyone gets 6 flex days, just days they can just choose to work remotely. So you add that up plus PTO, everything, like you're probably coming in rather than 40%, which is 2 days a week out of 5 working days. It's probably closer to something like 25% or 30% of the actual time in. So we actually flip the equation. Rather than being 1/4 remote, we're actually 1/4 of their time on site or in the office. The Jamie Dimon thing is interesting because I think what I find really unique about him is, as it relates to the study, is that this study talks about a prediction. So there are 2 big takeaways from the study. One is that we plateaued at, call it 26%, 25% of days being remote, but there's a belief that you plateau and then you're just kind of sitting there and that's the new normal. But some of these economists, and Nicholas Bloom is one that suggests that he thinks is going to change. He says if you look at the data and really drill down, younger CEOs and CEOs he identified less than 40 are way more likely to encourage hybrid work, right? Where older CEOs are way more likely to have on-site work. So it's just a matter of time for like older CEOs to retire, more younger CEOs come and take their roles, and that's going to shift and take that new normal from 26% up to 30% or 40% or whatever that number could be. But there's like a flip side of this equation. I think for the last, if you take the last 5 years, it has largely been an employee-friendly market from a job perspective. The last, call it 6 to 12 months, maybe a little bit longer, it's slowly shifted, not materially, but the pendulum has swung to be more employer-friendly, especially with these like conversations of AI job loss, especially in the white-collar workforce, et cetera. And JP Morgan CEO, Jamie Dimon, the same way he talks about pushing people into the office, he also makes a comment around we're one big recession away from being on site. He thinks that the power dynamic and the talent wars has led employers to defer and do more remote work than they personally would prefer because they're just trying to make sure they get the right people, et cetera. And then once that power dynamic and that pendulum sufficiently swings into the favor of an employer, which would happen in a recession, the on-site requirement is probably going to dial up. So I don't know who's right, whether it's the academic or the practitioner in Jamie Dimon, but I think there is a narrative to say it's not going to plateau, and maybe it does, but there is a strong argument narrative that it could go up or down, and only time will tell.
Sure. Yeah, and it could be it's plateauing in a relatively stable time, but all it would take is one market shock like Jamie Dimon to maybe upend things. Although at the same time, depending upon when that shock eventually comes, there is some likely some truth to the generational views on workforce arrangements, and as Nicholas Bloom pointed out, right, the cycle of older executives retiring, younger CEOs, kind of becoming more established, and also just like a lot of U.S. job growth, right? It historically comes from smaller companies that invest in their organizations, become larger, right? So the JP Morgans of the world may be setting kind of these norms for the past, and certainly still have their place in probably different industries. But I mean, I do think the other point that we've talked about a lot is the cost of remote work, specifically on younger workers, and how there's pretty convincing evidence that proximity to senior colleagues is important. Building skills in your 20s so that you don't have a experience or skill gap in your 30s is really important. And I feel like that's a pretty legitimate employer concern, and hopefully an employee concern as well, not just like a CEO preference. And that's one that still doesn't really feel like we have a great solution for, and almost brings us to this next article that we're going to chat about, which is how some of these younger generations are dealing with just the challenges that they experience both personally and professionally. And I think remote work is fair to say that that's a component of that.
Exactly, right. And probably a good segue, right? So the other article that was in Wellable Weekly was this concept that was, the same way you have a token maxing or all these old maxing terms. I feel like in the HR world, quiet something has been like another kind of like language, term that people have been using originally. I think in the heyday of COVID, it was quiet quitting, which was effectively employees just choosing not to do their job, but still staying like an employee and hoping no one finds out. If they do find out, maybe they had a second job or something like that. It became like quiet vacationing, which was not applying or requesting PTO and just taking time off and still be working, but taking certain days and certain afternoons, et cetera, off. And now this new concept per this article is this quiet coping, which quite frankly just has like a kind of a sad angle to it, right? For lack of a better term. Yeah. But effectively, there's this research. I would say when I say research, I kind of maybe do it in quotes per se because it's not academic research. Where the research from the remote work study and a lot of the other times we use the term research is true like academic research. Here's what it really is: a very sophisticated survey which has its roots in academia, but it's the self-medication generation study that was conducted by this private research firm called Prosper Insights and Analytics. And effectively what they did is they surveyed 18,000 US adults, and one in four-ish was effectively a Gen Zer. So the study or the article is really focused on Gen Z and specifically depression in Gen Z. And it's, what was crazy was that one in four, so roughly 25% of Gen Zers are depressed, right? And I think if you ask an employer and think about their population, they probably won't go that high, nor would they have really good indications for knowing what that number would be. And effectively, when someone is going through depression or having mental health challenges, they often are encouraged to go seek treatment, right? And that could be pharmaceutical, that could be therapy. There are a lot of ways to seek treatment. And the reality is what's happening is that these individuals have just kind of lost faith in the healthcare system. Partially, they're really young, so they don't have necessarily the financial resources. When you get on antidepressants, often you go through many different drugs because they don't always work the same. And so I forget the percentage, but it's very, very high percentage of individuals that their first prescription for antidepressants does not work. They end up trying different versions. That's really challenging for someone who doesn't necessarily have a lot of income, to have failed attempts that are financially challenging for them to go through in a state that they're not feeling great and not seeing results. So they often drop out maybe after the first round because they're not seeing the results that they expect. And the reality is the pharmaceutical industry and the kind of treatment industry expects that to occur, but that's not a really reasonable response for someone who's trying to get through this period in their life. And so if you just picture someone like 24-year-old employee, right, who's earning less than their peers, they have a bunch of failed prescriptions, setbacks that create these financial challenges that they can't really absorb. And what they do is they quiet cope. They deal with it on their own. That differs from person to person. Sometimes it's healthy coping, like maybe a creative outlet, but what's increasingly seeming to be the case, it's using things like cannabis and CBD as a frontline tool to combat or kind of help address their mental health challenges.
Right. I think some of the stats that you mentioned, also others that jumped out to me, right? That half of depressed Gen Zers are using marijuana. 70% of Gen Z users who are using CBD are specifically using it for mental wellness. And then, regardless of your position on that, I think everyone can likely support, some of those just wholesome activities that seems like that Gen Z are trying to engage in to cope. Things like crafting and reading, exercise, obviously, other kind of analog hobbies. I mean, those are pretty resourceful workarounds. And I mean, listen, like every generation copes in some way. And obviously this is, you're generalizing when you talk about how different generations cope at large. Every individual is different, but every generation has maybe some kind of reputational elements, right? For the boomer generation, it might be, after a hard day at work, come back and, have a glass of wine or something like that. Gen X, might just be checking out, right? And again, not to say this is what folks are doing in each of these generations per se, but these are some kind of reputations that are built up. It seems like Gen Z they're trying, right, to be intentional about really optimizing their own mental health, through some of these different kind of resourceful self kind of preservation techniques. And of course, the question is, what do employers do with this information, right? And I think there's absolutely an element of, well, lean in, right, to some of those wholesome, holistic health resources that Gen Z seems to be kind of coveting. And the other could be manager training, right? I think for years, managers were told that Gen Z has an attitude problem. And again, not to say that there aren't folks out there with attitude problems, but the data just suggests that maybe that was a little bit of a misguided statement. And if you're only solving for attitude, then you're probably solving for the wrong thing, right? And being aware of this and investing in some manager training to whether it's mental health first aid or other programs that can empower managers to have more productive conversations, be on the lookout for signals where folks may need some extra support. That can be where you could actually make a real impact.
Yeah, the manager training, it's maybe it's a good segue to even connect the previous article. It's like if you train managers sufficiently well, they still need this certain amount of inputs from a data perspective or visualizations to be able to interact with an employee to really understand and maybe potentially identify someone who is quiet coping and potentially help direct them to the resources available that the employer offers or other ways to maybe assist in their coping kind of process. But the reality is that is much easier to do in person, right? Mm-hmm. Being virtual, especially companies are virtual that don't have like a requirement to be on video, you're not even seeing the person. You're effectively doing a lot of phone calls with a group of people where you can imagine someone who's depressed, I would think maybe isn't chiming in as much and things like that. So it's really, really hard to identify that in general, in every scenario, especially when you're remote. So if we see this article and they're thinking about manager training, I think there's kind of an argument here that on-site work, even a minimal amount of it, is probably beneficial to address this kind of emerging trend that's really difficult. The one thing I'll just kind of maybe push back on the article is, and this is probably applies to both articles, is there's just tons of data. We're not going to cover that in this podcast, but if you go to either articles, we'll throw them into the show notes. They're just chart after chart of interesting information, not always ones that are going to like have a specific takeaway for you to learn from, but like just stuff that's just interesting. And what I found, when they had the article about Gen Z, it was so focused on Gen Z, but they would give a stat like, for example, 50% of Gen Z use marijuana as kind of a coping mechanism, right? That or who are depressed, use marijuana. Yeah, and you would think, okay, this article about Gen Z, they must be an outlier. But if you look at the chart, millennials are at 48%, right? If you look at CBD for mental wellness, Gen Z is at 70%, millennials are 62%. That's a little bit bigger of a gap. But if you go down the list, some of these are even flipping where the millennials have a higher percentage. And they're never that far off. So there is a bigger story. I don't think it's just Gen Z. I mean, I'll leave the writer of the article and the researchers to make that claim. But when I see the data at a high level, I think this is more than just a Gen Z story. That's probably worth, potentially noting. In the same way, just as we think about stats and articles, I would encourage everyone to go to the article about remote work. Literally, it's a presentation, like the raw data. It's like a PowerPoint slide, and every slide's like a chart. You can go through really quickly, and there's just so much interesting information there that's worth capturing from like the, what I found was probably most interesting is you look at the employee desire for work for home days based on like 1 day per week, 2 days per week, 3, 4, et cetera. And then the current amount of work from home day options. So an employer who offers 1 day per week, 2 days per week, et cetera, they're like opposite of each other, right? The 5 days per week employee is only 28% employees, which is actually higher than I would expect. But there's only 13% of employers who offer that. Likewise, there's like almost 30% of employees want no days in office, and the availability of that's very limited, right? So there's just a kind of the employer are in two different spaces here, and there's other stats on like work from home by education. So check it out. I think it's super valuable, and it's probably more than we can cover, but it's worth checking out and just diving a little more into it if your company is kind of thinking through like work from home and Gen Z employees and stuff like that.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's hard to find that kind of Goldilocks model, right? But it's probably some version. I would think the gap between employer policy and employee desire is probably a little tighter on those 2 or 3 day a week numbers. But we should check that out. I mean, that seems like a good place to wrap up today's podcast. Thanks as always for those who tune in. As a reminder, you can listen to Wellable Weekly on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts, and be sure to subscribe to Wellable Weekly newsletter for all the latest insights. Thank you.